gender, or location has a right to participate fully and equally in society. Consider this. It's frustrating enough to land after a flight only to find that your luggage didn't make it. Now consider the impact when that missing cargo is not your toothbrush or a change of clothes, but your wheelchair. And without it, you are unable to move around independently. Some people in Canada have to constantly fight for rights that others take for granted as basic rights. Whether access to these rights is delayed or denied, the impact is that some members of society are excluded or left behind. This is the current concern that these 4 audits are highlighting today. So now let me turn to our findings. Our first audit focused on whether Via Rail, the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority, and the Canadian Transportation Agency worked to identify, remove, and prevent barriers for travelers with disabilities. In 2019 and 2020, more than 1 million persons with disabilities who traveled on a federally regulated mode of transportation faced a barrier. Nous avons constaté que les 3 organisations
We found that all 3 organizations had identified some barriers and taken steps to improve accessibility. Via Rail held consultations with persons with disabilities to design its new fleet. Via Rail also consulted on its accessibility plan as well as its training programs, as did the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority. Despite improved accessibility, many barriers remained. For example, we found that websites were not fully accessible, which is very concerning because this is a barrier that travelers with disabilities often face. To further improve the accessibility of trains, planes, and other federally regulated modes of transportation, responsible organizations need to broaden their consultations, make their online content fully accessible, and use complaint data to identify, learn about, and prevent barriers. Our second audit examined whether Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada and the CRTC had improved the accessibility, affordability, and quality of high-speed internet and mobile cellular connectivity for Canadians in rural and remote areas.
When so much takes place online, it's critical for all Canadians to have access to reliable and affordable high-speed internet and mobile cellular services. This again is a matter of inclusion. When services are of poor quality, unaffordable, or unavailable, people are effectively excluded from participating fully and equally in the digital economy, accessing online education, banking, medical care, and government services, or working remotely. We found that overall, access to internet and mobile cellular services has improved across the country since our last audit in 2018. However, internet connectivity in rural and remote areas remains below 60% and below 43% on First Nations reserves. Therefore, while connectivity has improved in urban areas, the federal government's strategy has yet to deliver results for many rural and remote communities and First Nations reserves. We also found that there were delays in approving projects that were meant to bring services to rural and remote areas. This means that the 1.4 million households who are already underserved, First Nations reserves and people in rural and remote areas, are left waiting. Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada tracked only some dimensions of the quality and affordability of services. The department considers pricing to be part of affordability, but not household income. I find this puzzling, because if the price of the service is beyond a household's means, then connectivity will not improve, and some people will remain excluded. Nos constats font ressortir.
These findings emphasize the persistent digital divide for people living on First Nations reserves and in rural and remote communities, compared to people who live in urban areas. The government needs to take action so that there is affordable, high-speed connectivity coverage for Canadians in all areas of the country. Let's now turn to our report on international assistance. Global Affairs Canada spends an average of $3.5 billion each year to support gender equality in low and middle-income countries. But it is unable to show how this spending is improving outcomes for women and girls.
Weaknesses in the department's information management practices. This included not having a standardized approach for storing, managing, and using project information. In addition, the department has not set itself up to track long-term outcomes. So while it is able to show, for example, that money has been spent to provide nutritious meals, it does not know whether long-term health outcomes have improved for people who were supposed to receive these meals. These weaknesses make it impossible for Global Affairs Canada to accurately track and report on the outcomes of funded projects against the goals set out in Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy. These weaknesses were not new. They were flagged in a departmental internal audit in 2021. It is imperative that Global Affairs Canada act immediately to improve its information management practices and reporting on results, to show parliamentarians and Canadians the value of Canada's bilateral international assistance to support women and girls in low and middle income countries. Notre dernier audit.
Our final audit today focused on whether Public Services and Procurement Canada effectively managed the cost, schedule, and scope during the early phases of the rehabilitation program of Parliament's Centre Block. Based on a 2021 estimate, the rehabilitation is expected to cost $4.5 to $5 billion. This vast program involves many partners, such as the House of Commons, the Senate, the Parliamentary Protective Service, and the Library of Parliament. We concluded that Public Services and Procurement Canada used flexible approaches to effectively manage the planning, design, and early construction phases of the program. The department adjusted workflows to deal with delayed planning decisions on important user requirements, such as security.
The department consulted and worked with experts to balance environmental sustainability and accessibility elements while respecting the heritage nature of the building. Given the size and complexity of this undertaking, a streamlined decision-making process will be required to continue effectively managing the costs and timelines of the rehabilitation project as construction work accelerates between now and the planned completion date of 2030-2031.
These four audits provide a snapshot of progress and concerns in specific areas at one point in time. The public service has a duty to serve all Canada's peoples, and that means working actively to provide as full and equal access as possible to services, opportunities, and national heritage, both within Canada and abroad.
President.
Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening statement. We would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Hogan.
Turn to our members. Mr. Mazur, you have the floor for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the committee members to come in here today. I have to agree with the Auditor General here. Like this report is pretty startling, especially if you're living in rural Canada. It's nothing that we didn't know before, but over 1 million households in rural Canada, and over half of First Nations still don't have access to high-speed internet. I think it's quite startling. I've been hearing that. We've been all hearing this from rural Canada, and now the proof is in the pudding. And I can't get over the government keeps on saying that they have Canadians' backs and they're looking after rural Canada, but the facts aren't lying here. Like, I mean, this is quite detrimental to keeping Canada together. And I thank you so much for bringing these important points out. Another kind of startling, why is this all happening here? We have reports in your report here. You have, the Universal Broadband Fund was supposed to be kind of rolled out and awarded within 10 months. And actually, in your findings here, it took up to 22 months to have some to actually award broadband funds, award these projects. But it was only supposed to take 10 months. It took 22 months, so twice as long. And then the rapid response one, actually, we got adding up the numbers here. It was supposed to be really fast and get those shovel-ready kind of projects. They were supposed to be 5 to 13 weeks, and they were only 40, and they extended out to 41 weeks. So things are a mess, and they're not reporting, and there seems to be no accountability to this. So this is quite troubling for sure. And again, I thank you for bringing this, shining some light onto these problems. You raised concern about inaccurate connectivity data in your report, and I quote, "We were told that the report coverage information on the National Broadband Internet Service Availability Net was not only out of date, but also sometimes inaccurate. One potential consequence of these inaccuracies was that households or communities without coverage could be shown to have coverage. Does this mean that the government's connectivity data is inflated?"
So you are right, this audit does point out that the digital divide in our country persists. And you mentioned 1.4 million households. I guess to put that into context for some people, that's like every single person who lives in the city of Montreal doesn't have internet access. It's a lot of people. Then when it comes to data, what we were talking about there was the broadband map. So there is a map available online for service providers, anyone who might be interested in launching a project to increase accessibility, or even the average Canadian to go check out. And what we found is that a lot of the data was inaccurate and often pointed out by service providers during our consultations that they repeatedly ask the departments to update it. So that doesn't speak to the statistics that we found and we report on. When we talk about 4 out of 10 households in rural and remote communities not having internet, growing up to 6 out of 10 in First Nations communities, those are accurate numbers. They're validated. We also look at Statistics Canada. But it's that map, that coverage that is used to help fund projects. So you don't want service providers to think that an area is serviced and therefore not recommend a project or not try to get a project funded. So it's really about expanding the access, and so we do recommend that the departments find better ways to ensure that that information is accurate.
And I think you can imagine the frustration from rural Canadians and First Nations when you're being told you have service and you know in fact you don't. So I think we've got a long ways of doing to getting that data accurate and acting on that deficiency as well. The government claimed that they have lowered cell phone bills by 25%. However, you state in your report, and I quote, "The government's strategy did not include any national indicators or targets to evaluate whether affordability outcomes are being achieved." Did you find any data that proved that the government has made cell phone service more affordable?
Mr. Chair, I think that that's an excellent question. And when I look at affordability, I think beyond a price. And what we found was that the government is really just tracking price and comparing prices to ensure that they remain affordable. They haven't set targets linked to household incomes. And I believe that's missing half the story. While you can expand access across the country, it doesn't mean that households will pick up the internet service if it isn't affordable to them. So we do recommend that not only do they set indicators to monitor the progress, but that they also consider household income as they evaluate whether or not service is actually affordable.
So the statement that your cell phone service or bill has gone down by 25% is inaccurate? Or how would Canadian judge that from what
So
you're finding?
we did not verify in our audit actual invoices to Canadians about cell phone bills. So I can't comment on whether or not that would be an accurate one. But we globally sat back and said, how are you measuring whether the service that is being provided to Canadians is affordable? And just looking at price, in my view, is only looking at half the story. When household income is hugely important. We saw in a recent audit as well about housing, where they measure the affordability of rent by linking it to your income. And so I think that it might be a better way to monitor affordability is by looking at the two metrics.
That's about your time,
okay,
Mr.
thank you,
Mazur.
Chair.
We can come back to you if you like. Turning now to Ms. Yip, you have the floor for up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Hogan, in your opening statement, you mentioned these audits are important because every person, regardless of his or her or their health status, gender, or location, has a right to participate fully and equally in society. Some people in Canada have to constantly fight for rights that others take for granted as basic rights. I want to thank you for reminding us with such a visual example, because I found that those words really struck me, as well as your example with the lost luggage. And I think that's really important to remind us. And also that there is so much work to be done still to be in a truly inclusive society. So I'd like to ask you a question regarding the report to improve accessibility for travelers. What progress has been made to continue to achieve a barrier-free Canada?
So we were looking at the Accessibility Act and many of the new regulations that came into effect in 2020. And we found that the entities we looked at, which was Via Rail and the Canadian Air Transportation Security Authority, which is the federal organization that does your baggage screening in the airport, that they had made progress in developing an accessibility plan and doing significant consultations, having those consultations inform their training. But while there is some progress, there's much left to be done in order to reach the federal government's goal of barrier-free transportation by 2040. And I would highlight three things. One would be making sure that websites are fully accessible. Many travelers just start their journey there, and you want to be able to independently start a travel journey. The second would be around training to ensure that those providing services understand the lived experiences of persons traveling with disabilities. And then finally, a better use of complaint data to find systemic weaknesses or barriers that just aren't identified normally. So while progress has been made, there's still a lot that needs to be done.
Information not fully accessible.
So there are many regulations for websites in order to make them accessible, and we looked at Via Rail and Canadian Air Transportation Security Authority's websites, and we found some gaps against some of the regulations. About 15 to 17% of the regulations had not yet been met. Some are that the information was either inaccurate, so if you were using a reader to read the website, you would get inaccurate departure times, which is critically important if you're trying to book travel, but also that information was difficult to find. So for example, if you were trying to come through security at the airport with your service dog, it was very difficult to know what to expect or how to go about there. So those would just be two of the many examples that we saw. But there's significant regulations here, and it really is up to every service provider to show that they meet those.
There's enough resources put towards improving the accessibility online?
Well, we didn't look at people's websites and their IT resources when we looked at VIA and CATA. So I think that really is a question to ask to the departments. Some of the gaps were what I would say were probably minor, but others were rather significant if you're going to get inaccurate information. So it's important for them to look at it. But I would point to the Canadian Transportation Agency, which is the federal department that regulates these service for providers. And what we found is they only have 4 individuals who actually monitor all of the service providers and the over 400 different regulations. So we made a recommendation to the agency to determine whether or not they have sufficient resources to enforce and monitor the regulations that do exist.
Management not always complete the accessibility training.
So I think there's many reasons that we heard. Sometimes it was just a timing issue, or in some cases not really clear that individuals who were perhaps in management had to complete the training or not. But when they were made aware of that, improvements occurred. What we found is that members of management are not taking their their training on time. There's a time delay in which it needs to be taken, and then it needs to be renewed. And it's really important that those that set policy or coach individuals or have oversight over those actually dealing with individuals traveling with disabilities understand the policies and the weaknesses. And I know that Via Rail has since ensured that their management has taken the training, and that CATSA will do so by March 31st. So that's an improvement if everyone has done it in the short time frame.
How much time?
Go 30 seconds.
Did you want to make a comment about the data? Your last point in your recommendation?
Are you talking about the accessible transportation? Oh, about complaint data? Oh, I would be happy to talk about complaint data. What we found is that Via Rail and CATSA were really focusing in on dealing with addressing an individual's complaint. And we made recommendations to them to sit back and really look for sort of systemic problems across all their complaint data to see if maybe they have missed something. But then we also looked at the Canadian Transportation Agency, and we found that they don't really have access or the right to have access to a lot of the complaint data, for example, from airlines. And so without that data, they may be missing opportunities to provide better oversight or improve regulations in the future. So there are a few recommendations in our report related about using complaint data in a better way.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup.
Madame Sinclair Desgagnés, you have 6 minutes maximum. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for these interesting reports, enlightening reports. Nevertheless, they bring up this leitmotif that is coming up repeatedly as we read these reports. We see 2 points that recur regularly. One, data management by departments and agencies in government that seem to be defective and seem to date back from another decade. And even project management, which we see in the report on parliamentary rehabilitation. When a decision takes 2 years to be made, that's not something that would happen in the private sector. There seems to be a problem with management, or perhaps there is an issue there, at least to be desired, shall we say. Another issue that is very concerning for the everyday Canadian taxpayer is that government presents itself as the savior and into inclusion and rights for everyone. But in actual fact, we note that this song by Dalida about parole, 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 meaning just words. But unfortunately, outcomes are not there. When you look at international assistance, it's flagrant. You've already raised issues with respect to follow-up performance of these projects. In 2021, you mentioned these things, and there's been no improvement. A lot of money is being spent on a lot of programs, really for noble causes, to help women throughout the world. But at the end of the day, we have no way of knowing whether women are any better for it, are doing any better off. Having worked in these fields myself, I know performance indicators are called for by donors, benefactors. I'm wondering why in Canada there hasn't been more asked of the government as to the money that it's sending abroad. As to performance indicators, From a more global perspective, Madam Auditor General, you've done many performance audits in the past as well, I believe. What is the best practice when it comes to following the performance of these funds?
Alors, vous avez mentionné.
Well, you mentioned a number of points there. I'll focus on your last question. In my view, performance indicators need to focus on two things: products and progress or results. In our audit on international assistance that is focused on supporting gender equality, there are 26 indicators that were established to follow up on progress, but 24 out of these 26 indicators only have to do with products and not results. So I'll give you an example. We had looked at a project that wanted to make schools more welcoming to young girls. So they would build washrooms for girls with sanitary facilities so they could wash their hands. What Global Affairs could show us was that it had actually they had actually had these washrooms built, but they hadn't looked at how frequently girls were going to school. Or those are the objectives. We need both. We need the products, so that we can follow the progress over the years. At the end of the day, the major objective may take years to demonstrate, so you need both sides. How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair? 2.5 minutes. Rather, a minute and 50 seconds, rather. What you're saying is very interesting when it comes to results. What's missing? Is it a matter of data, organization, structure within the department? I'd say both. On the one hand, it's about how these things are established. They didn't really give themselves the opportunity to collect the information at the beginning of a program. When they set these targets to assess progress, they didn't include measures that had to do with results. So not having established that from the start means that over the years, you don't have that information. It can take years. If you look at improvement to sanitary facilities, it can take years to know what the results are. You need to start that data collection from the start and throughout. So that really has to do with planning. I'll admit it's difficult to look at results, but it is so crucial to do so. Absolutely. So quick question. For Parliament, this is something that I've been thinking about. We're talking about $4.5 to $5 billion for rehabilitation of Parliament. Why did you not include the construction work that is related to rehabilitation of the rehabilitation of the West Block, for instance, where parliamentarians had to go in the interim? Why not have a broader scope for the audit? West Block is complete. We're in the building. We wanted to really focus on work underway. This is a broad scope project involving many partners, and this will be the second time we will have looked at rehabilitation of Centre Block. The first time around, we noted that governance was stalling some decisions, and we wanted to see if there had been an improvement now at the beginning of the construction phase, and we're seeing that the decision-making is still fragmented and it takes time. It's the job of Public Service Procurement Canada to find ways to improve decision-making because many partners are involved here, and you need to find a balance between the environment, accessibility, the user's needs, and the heritage aspect of the building itself. There's a lot that needs to be managed, and it's time to improve decision-making. Thank you very much.
You have the floor for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I too want to thank the Auditor General and her office for what I believe are good reports for us as members of the Public Accounts Committee to review. And in particular, I really appreciate your opening comments. Oftentimes when I am in this committee, I find oftentimes there's the similar trend that you see, which is that there seems to be processes that are intended to include Canadians, many Canadians from diverse backgrounds, and oftentimes they don't make the mark. For decades and decades and decades, people fall behind. These issues that you're presenting, both the accessibility challenges for persons with disabilities, the digital divide, they've been well known to Canadians for a long time. They may have felt it isolated and alone at that time. But I think what you're saying here in many ways verifies their truth. So I want to thank you for that. It's oftentimes the hardest piece for marginalized groups to obtain a credible assertion to these experiences. And without that, it makes it very difficult for the government, I think, in some part to understand fully the totality of these experiences. So I want to thank you for your work and truly centering people. And I really want to talk about the importance of people and the importance of how these investments or lack thereof don't in fact help some people. And there's these clear audits, one being the accessibility challenges present within transport and via rail. The analogy used about the lack of a wheelchair upon arrival, I can only sympathize with that kind of pain and struggle. It would make me fearful of wanting to travel ever and never wanted to experience the vastness of this great country. It was a kind of sadness that I think many of us have been on the opposite end of. We've been able to go everywhere, whether it's by plane, train, or car. We can go everywhere in this country and see, in my home province, beautiful mountains, or if it's the Great Lakes, or if it's the oceans of either end. We have that freedom. But persons with disabilities still don't. And it's a shameful reality that I'm happy that you've highlighted here, and one that I hope our committee in our report truly identifies and changes that need to be made within Transport Canada. I do also want to make a mention about the digital divide and how hurtful that digital divide has become, particularly particularly while we navigate COVID. COVID-19 is still with us. It's been a devastating impact on rural and remote areas, more so than urban areas at times. Part of that is the challenges that parents and particular teachers in rural settings have had to have. I know I've spoken to many teachers where their students didn't have connectivity. That meant years of children, particularly on First Nations reserves, that were unable to learn. These have long-lasting effects. We're talking about a kind of society we want to build, and when we don't include people within our digital spaces, which is the growing space in Canada, which is one that First Nations find themselves continuously excluded, it's clear by these reports what has to be done in terms of closing the gap, and I really appreciate the auditor's work on making sure that these are identified. And last, I do want to make comment on a third report, the global efforts toward better outcome for women, and the fact that during this really challenging time across the globe, where I believe women leadership is necessary now more than ever, we're seeing at the same time troubling concerns with the lack of attention towards violence against women, not just here in Canada, but right across the globe. And so it's imperative that our country be a leader in this space and demonstrate the value of women, both in government but in every organization. And it's troubling to hear that the investments toward this end aren't hitting the gaps. And you mentioned a school, for example, construction of bathrooms in a school, but not knowing how many girls are going to that school. These are a really important piece for us to understand because, of course, we're in Canada and sometimes we're isolated by these realities, and we think, that's awesome, and awesome that we're investing in this, but we don't often see the gaps of our results, and that's an important piece that I also want to mention. I do want to turn directly to the digital divide in First Nations communities to speak particularly to some troubling facts. On your website, you published today in association with your reports clear statistics of accessibility challenges for First Nations. In my home province of Alberta and right across the prairies, you can see clearly that we have a huge gap between First Nations and the rest of Canadians in those places. Just to read some of these facts, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba average below 25% in terms of First Nations accessibility. Alberta, 26.9% of First Nations have digital connectivity. Saskatchewan, 10%. Manitoba, 14%. But if you look at comparable jurisdictions just beside Alberta, if you cross the border, First Nations have 71.5% access. You look Northwest Territories, just north of my province, even further, even larger and more remote, 74.89%. Ms. Hogan, why is Alberta and many of the prairies so far behind these other statistics, particularly British Columbia and Northwest Territories?
So it's an excellent question, and I knew when we published this map that we would get this kind of question, but we really sat back and didn't dissect it by province. Our objective was really to look at whether the government was meeting its goal overall. And it's clear when you look at all of the First Nations reserves together that when 6 out of 10 households do not have internet, that's the majority. And, it's really a sort of a fundamental need, I think, in today's society, and the pandemic has just accelerated that need. What I would point to is probably the lack of slowness in the approval of some of the funding projects that are available. We know that funding is there. It's just that the two entities are slow to approve those projects, and the longer it takes for projects to get out there, the more individuals in the prairies and other parts of the country will wait.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Ms. Gray, you have the floor for approximately 3 minutes.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to everyone for being here today. My questions are on Report 1, the accessible transportation for persons with disabilities. And my first question is, were you concerned by the delayed or failed uptake in accessibility training by Via Rail and Canada Air Transport Security Authority by their senior management, even when it was mandatory?
I'm always concerned when training isn't taken, but more so here when it comes to accessibility needs. The training of supervisors and executive is just as essential as those who actually deliver the services, because they either set the policies or guide and exercise oversight over individuals providing direct services. So here the training needs to be done within, I think, 60 days of employment, and then it needs to be repeated. It needs to be refreshed, and it really does help identify unconscious biases and really tackle what I would say is an attitudinal barrier, perhaps sometimes when it comes to accessible transportation. And so Via Rail has told us that all their executive have since our audit completed that training, and that at CATSA they will do it by March 31st. So I'm happy to see that they'll take that seriously, and hopefully they'll continue that trend.
Great, thank you. The report mentions that there was only one on-site inspection and 47 virtual by the Canadian Transportation Agency to identify, remove, and prevent barriers. Do you think that inspections in person would be required to fully identify accessibility issues? And did you find virtual inspections to be as effective as the in-person ones?
So in our audit, we didn't compare the virtual inspections to previous years where they would have perhaps been done in person. Virtual was the mode used mostly during the pandemic. In my view, what we saw in those inspections, however, is that they were really just focusing in on the design of the service instead of the actual service delivery. And that's why the fact that they're now moving back to in-person inspections, I believe, will help improve that oversight mechanism and then hopefully help remove barriers.
Great, thank you. My last question is: the Canadian transportation industry is responsible for enforcement, and yet they don't have access to complaints. And my understanding is there's an obligation for airlines to report in other countries, such as in the United States, but not in Canada. Even Canadian airlines operating in the U.S. And so there appears to be less oversight in Canada. By the Canadian Transportation Association. Are there rules, in fact, that are different? How does this play out practically? And is there something that should be changed?
So the accessibility requirements between Canada and the United States are rather similar. What is different is some of the authority that the Canadian Transportation Agency has in its oversight. So it's the sort of reporting and monitoring that is different between the two countries. What we found is that CTA doesn't really have the authority to ask for all the complaint data. So, for example, from airlines. If you look at in the United States, where Canadian air carriers are required to report to the U.S. authority any damaged or stolen wheelchairs or lost wheelchairs or any issues with service dogs, that same mandatory requirement does not exist here in Canada. And we identified that as a gap and made a recommendation to CTA and said that they should try to find ways to get access to it. That might be the policymakers giving them that authority, or them working collaboratively with airlines and to get access to that information in order to improve oversight.
And thank you very much, Ms. Gray. I can come back to you if you have further questions. Mr. Genuis, and just for committee members, this is informal, so if you have questions, catch my eye. If not, we'll go to those members that do. So, Mr. Genuis, you have the floor for 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm the lead for our Party for International Development, and I was very struck by your report 4 that looks at the dissonance, frankly, between the words the government uses around empowering women and gender internationally and the reality of what's happening. We know that Liberals love to talk about gender and international development. Your report shows that they're not measuring results. 50 out of 60 projects you looked at didn't have complete data. 35 of those 60 projects, only 35 of those projects actually measured policy indicators, and the vast majority of those policy indicators actually had nothing to do with results. 2 out of 3 of the spending commitments were not met, and those are spending commitments. Those aren't results commitments. Those are simply spending commitments. So massive gap between the rhetoric on gender and the reality in terms of what is not being measured and what is not being achieved. And I think, Sally, this underlines that the government is trying to push a particular message to a domestic audience about what they do and don't care about, and yet they can't be bothered to consistently track the data. I want to ask you to share a bit more about the challenges you had in accessing this data. What kind of challenges did you experience in getting access to the data that the government did have? And how do you explain the fact that in so many cases there's no data being gathered around outcomes whatsoever?
So we looked at how Global Affairs is managing international assistance to support gender equality in low to middle income countries. And we found that they weren't able to show us how all the spending, was $3.5 billion a year, actually improved the lives of women and girls. And I would point to two issues, and it will link to the issue that we had about getting access to information. So the first was the significant weakness in information management. So that is fundamental, and it was systemic across the organization. It was from gathering data, how you store it, how you manage it together, roll it up, and use it for decision making. A lot is done by paper or not even in the same IT system if there is IT systems. And so it took us about 4 months to gain access to the information that we needed to do our work. That just shows me that senior management's not using it for day-to-day decision making. And then we saw that it really is an incomplete external reporting because they're only putting about half of their projects in their external reporting. The second thing I would point to as to why they couldn't show us how the investment was improving the lives of women and girls would be about the indicators. So they didn't set themselves up to monitor outcomes. 24 out of 26 of their indicators really just looked at results along the way, like little things along the way. I would give you an example about providing nutritious meals to women. And they might track how many meals were delivered, but then did not set themselves up to monitor whether health would improve over time. And sometimes results, especially in these kinds of programs, take time to measure, but they haven't set themselves up. So it's really about the design right up at the outset about these projects, but then about the management of all the data linked to it to show the value of this investment.
And thank you. Pardon me. And thank you very much. I'm turning next to Mr. Fragascatos. And Ms. Shanahan, I do see you online there. Mr. Fragascatos, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Hogan, for your report, and to your staff as well. I want to put the matter in context, but think broader as well. And that's why I want to ask about the international situation. In the course of your work, did you look at what other democracies are faced with in terms of connectivity in rural and remote areas and how Canada compares?
We did try to do some comparisons. We turned to the OECD as well to look at what they were doing. It is difficult to compare Canada to some other countries. We have a very geographically vast country with low population density in many areas. And if we look at our urban centers, they're being served to 99%. It's really those hard to reach. And I think that's why the issue of getting to the last few is going to be costly. And we recommended that the departments really look at how much it will cost to get there. And that's why linking it back to household income when you look at affordability is essential. Most other countries do focus just on price. And so we do think that given the nature of Canada, looking at household income is essential because of how costly it will be to reach the last few.
Understood. And there you just used the phrase, the nature of Canada, and in the early part of your answer, you talked about the uniqueness of this country, looking at the OECD, making comparisons, and in some ways, I don't want to put words in your mouth, it sounds like I'm asking you to compare apples to oranges, and point well taken in that regard. So based on that, can we say that Canada finds itself in a very unique position, certainly among democracies, when it comes to this whole question of ensuring connectivity for all citizens? Not every country has the remoteness of Canada, right? Vast landscape, very hard to serve all Canadians. This does not mean that we shouldn't make every effort to do so, and that there's many improvements to be made in getting to that goal. But are we unique among democracies? Is that a fair understanding?
I'm not sure I would go that far. I think not every country has the means of Canada as well. And here we found that, the funding is available. It's that it's slow to see projects being approved in order to be rolled out. And I think while you can compare us to other countries and see that we're doing well, if we look at pricing and, we're following the same sort of metrics as other countries are. But when you sit back and look at it, we do have 4 out of 10 households in rural and remote communities with no internet, and 6 out of 10 on First Nations reserves, which when you look at today's society, internet being really a fundamental need, I think there's a lot of work left to be done.
Well, certainly no disagreement there on the importance of the issue and the work that needs to be done. Where have you looked at previous years? For example, 10 years ago, where were we when it comes to connectivity, both in terms of the Indigenous focus?
These amendments that were proposed by the Senate, I think that are fairly well received, Mr. Speaker. Having said all of that, as I indicated, I did want to just provide my compliments and thank the Senate for their thorough review of the legislation. Mr. Speaker, I know that for some of us, making the legislation stronger is of great benefit. We want to see that. We saw some changes, some modifications that were talked about at the committee stage also. But it's important that we recognize why it is that we have this legislation here in the first place, Mr. Speaker. And that's when I made reference at my opening remarks that C-11 is all about updating the Canada Broadcasting Act. And I've had the opportunity to draw the comparisons from previous 20 or 1991 technology to where we're at today, Mr. Speaker. And for all intents and purposes, there is no real comparison. It's almost like 2 totally different worlds. And what C-11 does is it puts the system, if I can put away the platform versus our traditional broadcasting, on a level playing field. So not to support C-11 is to say that it's okay to continue in the fashion that we are currently going, where there is an unlevel playing field, Mr. Speaker, for those traditional broadcasters versus what's happening with online platforms. Mr. Speaker, if we take a look at 1991, and I've referenced this in the past where internet was something in which you used your telephone line and you actually called into it. And you would hear the buzzing and so forth, and ultimately the double click, which says that you're now online. And the type of computer technology that was being used at that time, Mr. Speaker, is a fraction of the speed and the capacity of what we use today. In fact, Mr. Speaker, things such as Disney Plus, Crave, Netflix, Spotify, YouTube. These were virtually non-existent back then, Mr. Speaker. So the Canadian Broadcast Act did not reflect the technology and the advancements that were going to be coming in the years beyond 1991. This legislation puts all those platforms on a level playing field. A level playing field because what we recognize is that Canadian content really does matter, Mr. Speaker. And one only needs to take a look in terms of those traditional media outlets and the impact that the Broadcasting Act and Canadian content has had on the traditional media forms, the CTVs and the CBCs and so forth, Mr. Speaker, the radio programming that is out there. And I suspect that if you look at many of the stars that we have today and in the past, they would recognize that Canadian content mandates does ensure that Canada is better reflected in what is actually being produced and promoted, not only here in Canada, but it also enables, in very real and tangible way, Canadians become sensational hits outside of Canadian borders, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell you that at the end of the day, some of the programs that I watched when I was growing up existed in good part because of the Canadian content. And had we not had it back then, I don't know to what degree we would have had some of the programs and the success that we have witnessed. In the Liberal Party, we recognize, our arts community as an industry that not only provides jobs and opportunities, but in many ways it's a reflection of our heritage in terms of who we are as a nation is often seen in the types of programming that comes out of Canadian content, Mr. Speaker. And that is something that should be encouraged. I have used on many occasions the example of Folklorama, because I really believe that Folklorama embodies so much in terms of our heritage that it's worthy of mentioning again. Once a year for 2 weeks, Manitoba, in particular Winnipeg, comes alive with our celebration of diversity and heritage. And if you attend some of these pavilions, roughly about 50 pavilions, 24, 25, 1 week long, and then the following week there's another 24, 25 pavilions. And what you'll see is, by touring the pavilions, some amazing talents, performers that will act, that will sing, that will provide all forms of different services in the production of these pavilions, of the hosting of these pavilions. I'd go deeper by saying, when you see some of these young singers or performers, it's just not during that 1 week. Because what happens is that becomes a venue for them to ultimately showcase their talent. But in fact, throughout the year, Mr. Speaker, you will see that they will actually be practicing, rehearsing, and often getting other gigs, if I can use the word gigs, Mr. Speaker, throughout the year. Many of these performers and actors and singers will often get to the next level, where they will participate in the filming industry, or you will hear them on radios. Mr. Speaker, these are the types of things that we should be encouraging. Last night, or the night before last night, Saturday night, I was at the Canada Life Center where the Winnipeg Jets play. And we had some guests from the Philippines, Mora and Company. Super fantastic show, Thousands of people came to witness it. And prior to that show, highlighted local talent, Mr. Speaker. Some incredible local talent that is there. I say that because whether it's events such as that, the folkoramas, the many types of different events that take place, arts performances that take place throughout our communities, virtually in every region of our country, we have the potential to support by getting behind Bill C-11. If you understand and appreciate our heritage, as you understand and appreciate the potential industry and how it can deliver for Canadians, I think that all members should be getting behind C-11. Because, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't take too much to reflect on some huge international success stories. You know, well, I would use the example of Schitt's Creek. Schitt's Creek, to counter what the member opposite is saying, originates, or some of the actors originate from some good Canadian content in the previous years. And many of these actors and actresses and singers get their opportunity to be able to contribute, especially in their earlier years, in part because of Canadian content, at least, if not directly, indirectly. So the member throws me off a little bit, but I can tell you that Schitt's Creek is a wonderful production here in Canada, and many people can understand and appreciate values that are being espoused here in Canada. And the film itself is now being recognized worldwide because of all the awards that it has received. One can talk about endless numbers of actors and actresses and singers, performers that have actually made it big on the world stage, Mr. Speaker. And a lot of that would not have been possible to the degree in which it has been if not for directly or indirectly ensuring that we had Canadian content. And that is why I believe members need to reflect on the importance of C-11 in leveling the playing field. Not to mention the jobs that are created, Mr. Speaker. You know, if not every week, every other week, it seems that there is some form of a production of sorts that is taking place in the province of Manitoba. In some provinces or territories, more so, and some possibly less so. All I know is that there is a healthy industry that's there to support a growing industry as a whole, Mr. Speaker. And within that, you have jobs. Jobs that are there, that are contributing in a very real and tangible way. So C-11 does more than just promoting Canadian content. It also ensures that there's going to be an industry that's healthier and more vibrant. And as a direct result of that, Mr. Speaker, some of the smaller centers are actually seeing productions being carried out. I think of a program like Corner Gas from the prairies. These are productions, I would suggest to you, at least in part, if not directly, indirectly, that are provided the opportunities because of issues such as Canadian content. And there has been some movement towards Canadian content from some of the different platforms, Mr. Speaker. but nowhere near enough. So when you think in terms of what it is that the legislation does, it's a modernization of 1991. And what it does is it says that you have an obligation to contribute, Mr. Speaker. More specifically, what does the legislation do? It brings online streaming services under the jurisdiction of the Broadcasting Act. It requires online streaming services that serve the Canadian market to contribute to the production of Canadian content. It prioritizes support for the content from Francophone, Indigenous, LGBTQ2+, racialized, and other equity-seeking creators. It ensures online broadcasters will showcase more Canadian content, Mr. Speaker. In essence, it modernizes outdated legislation and brings the system into the 21st century. This is what the legislation does, Mr. Speaker. And for whatever reasons, the Conservative Party is voting against the legislation, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell you what it is that the legislation does not do, because the Conservatives will try to give you the false impression in trying to ratchet up hard feelings towards C-11 or providing support for misinformation about the legislation, Mr. Speaker. This is what the legislation does not do. It does not impose regulation on content everyday Canadians post on social media. It does not do that. Member from the Conservative Party, and there's one that's anxious to get up, Mr. Speaker, I can tell by the comments that she's consistently been making. Members such as her do a disservice to Canadians when they try to say anything other than the fact that it does not impose content everyday Canadians post on social media. To say otherwise is not true. It does not impose regulations on Canadian digital content creators, influencers, or users, Mr. Speaker. We cannot be more clear than making that statement, Mr. Speaker. But yet you still get members of the Conservative Party that will say that it does, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Order. As we're in the first round of debate here. Of course, the honourable member has an unlimited time to present his thoughts. The next speaker will have the same amount of time to get her thoughts out as well. So, and I'm more than happy to allow her to ask the first question when that time comes. So, I just want to make sure that the conversation stays calm in this chamber. The honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Getting back to what it is that the legislation does not do. It does not censor content or mandate specific algorithms on streaming services or social media platforms. It does not do that, Mr. Speaker. But you know, Mr. Speaker, when I sit down and the member opposite stands up, she's going to give you all sorts of contradictions to some of the things that I'm saying here, yet we know for fact, Mr. Speaker, that it does not do that. One could ask why, and I'll pose that question after I finish what I think is probably the most important thing that this legislation does not do. It does not limit Canadians' freedom of expressions in any way. Mr. Speaker, in any way, it does not limit Canadians' freedom of expression in any way, shape, or form. Now, you know, Mr. Speaker, last time I spoke on this legislation, I think earlier that day, I had an email from one of the regulars. We all get the regulars, Mr. Speaker. And this individual, I suspect, might not necessarily be overly sympathetic to me or possibly even my party, Mr. Speaker. But he was being very critical, saying that C-11 was going to take away his freedom that he was not going to be able to communicate the way he wants to be able to communicate in terms of the internet, or to be able to express. That we were putting in limitations on this particular individual, Mr. Speaker. We all know that that is not the case. That what happens is that often a opposition party, and 9 times plus out of 10, it's the Conservative opposition party, that will oppose legislation. And there's key things that they like, Mr. Speaker. And then they will amplify that. And in this case, they're trying to give the impression, the false impression, that C-11 has an impact on a person's freedoms. And, Mr. Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. You know, I take great pride in the fact that it was a liberal government many years ago, before I was elected for the first time in 1988, well before then, that brought in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We are the party that guarantees rights and freedoms, Mr. Speaker. And when you take a look at what it is that C-11 is all about, and the work that has been done on this legislation, it's not like it's new. This is legislation that's been debated now in one form or another for years. It's been debated for years, yet the Conservative Party is still stuck on wanting to raise money. They like to say that the government is, and it's an attack on your freedoms, your ability to be able to speak. And then they say, if you agree and you want to donate to our party, please do. Well, Mr. Speaker, the fundraising is hopefully going to be coming to an end on this issue. You know, even members of the bloc, I know, are relatively supportive of the legislation. In fact, there are some legislatures, I think it was the Quebec legislature, that has actually passed a unanimous resolution inside in the Assembly in the province of Quebec, supporting the legislation. The creators, the individuals that are so much impacted, not only from today, but from yesterday, and the individuals thinking about the future, are supportive of the legislation. Mr. Speaker, this is legislation that will make a positive difference in every way if you stick to the facts. If you want to talk about rumors and false information, well, it could be an endless debate, as the Conservative Party of Canada has clearly demonstrated. As the next speaker that stands up will clearly demonstrate, Mr. Speaker. It will be all about how big government, in cooperation with the Bloc and the NDP and the Green Party, and most Canadians, how big government's trying to limit our freedoms of speech and being able to upload documents onto the internet, whether it's a CAT file or whatever it might be, Mr. Speaker. You know, that's the type of thing in which we have to deal with. To my Conservative friends, I asked them to give it a break. Let's look at the facts, move on. This legislation now has gone through the House before the last election, where it was kind of brought in, and then after the election, the most recent election, it was brought back in. It went through second reading, interesting debates and discussion during committee stage. It came back in for report stage and third reading, ultimately then passed on to the Senate. The Senate now has had the opportunity to take a look at the legislation. It's brought forward a number of amendments. The government has agreed to a number of those amendments, Mr. Speaker. It's time that we pass this legislation. There is no justification outside of the Conservatives' desire to raise more money on false information, Mr. Speaker. There is no justification. If you want to support the industry, if you want to level the playing field, now's the time for us to support, and let's get this legislation through the House of Commons, Mr. Speaker. And it's with those few words that I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Lethbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member made quite the accusations against this side of the House. Of course, borderline on being actually unparliamentary in his language. Nevertheless, he makes a few false points. He says that in this legislation, the government doesn't go after user-generated content. That's interesting to me because we heard from legal expert after legal expert, content creator after content creator, witness after witness at both the House of Commons Committee and the Senate Committee that in fact this legislation in its current state does. Now the Senate heard those concerns and they actually tried to fix the legislation in that regard by taking a part of Clause 4 out. Now, with that, it would have removed user-generated content. However, this government has decided to make sure that that amendment is not accepted. Further to that, this government has decided that the amendment to remove Clause 7 is not accepted. Now, let me explain the impact of this. Clause 7 gives Cabinet the ability to direct the CRTC with regards to this legislation, which means that there is obvious opportunity for political interference, which under any government, whether this government or successive governments, is wrong and should rightly concern Canadians. Further to that, user-generated content under Clause 4 absolutely is scoped into this legislation. This government had an opportunity to accept that amendment from the Senate. They've decided not to. You put those two together and you can quickly see that Cabinet does in fact intend to direct the CRTC to regulate Facebook videos or cat videos, as the member says. Does he have anything to say in response to that?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Amazon's got a great sale on tin hats. You know, at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we
have a point of order from the Honourable Member for Lethbridge.
I'm sorry, but the Honourable Member across from me just referred to me as if I was wearing a tin hat. I referred to amendments that were brought forward in Senate that are on paper. To refer to me as if I am some whacked out individual wearing a tin hat is totally inappropriate and a demise on my character or an attack on my character, which is inappropriate in this place. And I would ask for him to show some decency and offer an apology.
Follow up the point of order from the Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, if the member had called her a whacked out individual, which was her terms, that would be unparliamentary. There's nothing unparliamentary about a sale on tin hats. And I think it would be a real threat to freedom of expression if parliamentarians...
Okay, we're getting into debate here. We're getting into debate. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would withdraw the comments that has offended the member.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Speaker, but you'll notice the member was saying, if this, if that, if this. You know, so if all these combination of things occur, well, then this could happen. Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister, myself, many others here on the floor, inside the committee, have made it very clear that that is not the case. Well, the member talks about Clause 4, and let me just very quickly here, if you're going to allow me the time, Mr. Speaker. The minister's intention has always been clear to exclude the content of Canadians and social media creators. Some online platforms only act like broadcasters right now. Those are familiar streaming services like Netflix, Crave, and Disney. Other online platforms consist entirely of user-generated content. They are clearly excluded in 4.1. Mr. Speaker, the member knows this. Yet, the member, along with others, will continue to, and that's why I say, it is a form of misrepresentation of what it is that the legislation is doing. Mr. Speaker, we are not in any way doing what it is the member is suggesting. It's just wrong.
Commentaire, l'honorable député de Laurentides-Labelle.
The honourable member for Laurentides-Labelle. Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you. I am stunned. I'm not the point person on this file. I'd like to thank my colleague from Drummond, but right now we're at the second stage. We've looked closely at all sorts of aspects: protection, promotion. We're here to protect people in the cultural sector. That's a sector that I come from myself. And so my question for my honorable colleague across the way, people in my riding are saying, we're talking about $70 million a month being lost, more than 1.5 billion in total. So some people here seem to not understand the importance of culture. We know that there's going to be a sunset clause here. We're being told that things will be revisited, but we've been waiting for this since 1991. So I'd like to ask my colleague, what is happening here with the opposition that is so scared of freedom of expression?
Gary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the member puts it quite well in terms of trying to understand the official opposition and the obstructionist role that they're playing in trying to modernize the Canada Broadcasting Act. As I say, the legislation, the essence of the legislation is to ensure that there's a level playing field, ensuring that there is Canadian content. Canadian content in the past is clearly demonstrated to be very effective. One only needs to look from a historical perspective in terms of just how successful it's been in terms of elevating and encouraging and developing local artists of many different forms in different regions of our country. If you support our arts community, you should be getting behind this legislation. The member brought to my attention the economic costs of not doing so are very real, they're tangible. Let's show the arts industry that we genuinely care. Let's pass this legislation. The time for debate, we've had all sorts of discussion over the years. Let's get on and pass the legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question Kamal-Tarr, the Honourable Member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think one of the frustrating elements of dealing with Bill C-11 is on the one hand we have the Liberal member who I don't think mentioned Facebook or Google once, but he talked about Corner Gas, a television show that I haven't seen in 15 years, as though that's the cutting edge of Canadian technology. So I think we should focus on at hand. But we have the Conservatives who are claiming that taking on some of the richest corporations in the world and making them pay into their system is going to lead to the son of Pierre Elliott blocking people's access to cat videos. That is their position. Now, I know if we blocked access to cat videos, it might cause a lot of problems for the Conservative backbench who have a very short attention span during question period. But I want to ask my honourable colleague, number one, is this government trying to ban cat videos? And number two, what about Facebook or Google threatening to ban access to Canadian use of online journalism? That's the question. You have never heard the Conservatives have a problem with Google telling Canadians they're not going to be allowed to read online news articles because they're being blackmailed by the tech giants. I'd like to ask my honourable colleague, is this government going to stand up for Canadians' right to access information, not just cat videos, but news content that is being threatened to be blocked by either Google or Facebook?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, assure the member that cat videos and personally, I'm a dog person. Cats, dogs. I like dogs. Cats, whether it's cats or dogs being uploaded on Facebook with their owners, Mr. Speaker. I think it's great to see, encouraging. In no way, as I've pointed out, tried to make it as clear as possible. Is this going to put any sort of limitations on individuals? Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, C-18 deals with a good part of what the member was referring. That's the Online News Act, Mr. Speaker, that will ensure that these big companies such as the Googles and the Facebooks pay their fair share. And that's all we're asking for, whether it's this legislation or C-18, to ensure that we're leveling the playing field and everyone's contributing a fair share, Mr. Speaker. In this case, it's about Canadian content.
Questions and comments? Question Kamal-Tarr, the Honourable Member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fact that we're debating C-11 in a context politically and in terms of what my constituents see of a barrage of false information that this is taking away freedoms is very distressing, but it is also not perfect legislation. So I want to say to my honourable parliamentary colleague, the parliamentary secretary, absolutely, I couldn't agree more. This does not affect freedom of expression. That's protected in the Broadcasting Act. is protected in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But I likewise do not understand why the government removed the Senate amendments to make it very clear that it does not affect user-generated content. I'm concerned about that because I think it needlessly confuses the situation where we need to pass C-11 to protect Canadian writers and Canadian artists in a context where their access to work has been declining rapidly because of online streaming services.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary in under a minute.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we have seen over the last number of months is a great deal of effort by a large number of people to ultimately see if there's ways in which we can improve the legislation. We have had recommendations through the committee stage between second and third reading, and now today we have amendments proposed by the Senate, most of which we are accepting, Mr. Speaker. Where there's changes that are changing or going outside the scope of the legislation, we're recommending that we don't accept those changes. But all in all, Mr. Speaker, I think that we have a good piece of legislation here that's even been made better with some of the amendments that have been proposed by the Senate.
Reprise du débat, continuing debate. The Honourable Member for Lethbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Imagine for just a moment going into a bookstore, and as soon as you walk into the bookstore, there's a guide, and you are allowed to go through this bookstore only with his or her help. Now, in this bookstore, there are yellow books, and there are purple books, and blue books, and green books, red books. Oh, there are red books. In fact, the red books are the only ones that the guide will take you to. The yellow books, the green books, the blue books, the purple books, the pink books, well, they're all there, seemingly available to you as a consumer. But the guide is actually not permitted to take you to look at those books. The guide is only permitted to take the consumer to the red books. So of course, yes, in theory, you have this entire store with all of these lovely books. But at the end of the day, the guide will only take you to the red books. Now you might ask, well, I'd like to go through the bookstore on my own without the assistance of this guide. He seems rather ridiculous. But no, that is not an option. You must go through the store with this guide, because that is the rule of the store. This is the internet under the Liberal Government of Canada, if Bill C-11 passes. The internet will be guided through a Liberal government's lens. They will determine what content Canadians can and cannot see. Now, in theory, there's this big, wide-open internet with all of this content. But of course, the vast majority of that content will be bumped down in priority, in other words, made undiscoverable. But the red content will be made top priority, moved toward page 1. This is where Canadians will be pointed to. So when they go on YouTube and want to find information that they care about, or watch videos that they're passionate about, or explore topics that they want to learn more about, instead, the government will make sure that they are pointed toward videos that the government has curated for them to watch. That is what C-11 is all about. Now, an individual might say, well, I will use my search bar to look for the things that I wish to watch. No, you won't, because the government will take control of one's search bar and actually direct them toward the things the government wants them to watch. That is how the internet will be curated. That is how it will work. Legal experts came to our committee at the House of Commons and also appeared in Senate. Within the House of Commons, we heard from several who actually likened this bill.
Point of order from the Honourable Member for l'Honourable Député de Berthier-Masquet.
Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquet. Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Speaker. The interpreter has said that there's an earpiece situated too close to the microphone, and that's creating some feedback, so the earpiece might need to be moved.
That may be too close to the microphone there. Is there a headset anywhere near, or things turned up that shouldn't be? So we'll just make sure everything is clear. That's probably that one. There you go. Perfect. All right, so let's hope everything's going to be fine. Merci beaucoup pour
Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge, and apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, with Bill C-11, those who enjoy online streaming platforms such as Netflix or Disney Plus, or who enjoy watching videos on platforms such as YouTube, or maybe even just scrolling through Facebook and looking at people's pages, these individuals will be impacted in terms of the type of content that they can access, in terms of what they can watch, because Bill C-11 will determine the type of information that is put in front of them. Bill C-11 will determine the content that is put in front of our eyeballs. It will control, and by saying Bill C-11, what I mean is, according to Clause 7 of the bill, actually it will be Cabinet that can determine through the CRTC what Canadians can see, post, or hear online. Again, it's Cabinet, based on Clause 7, that will be given that authority. Now that's scary. That's scary for any government that is in power, because that means that Cabinet, which is partisan, will be directing what we can see, say, or post online. Now, instead of giving a viewer more of what they want, YouTube will be instructed to give more of what the government wants. Again, this is very scary for most Canadians. Now, the government will claim, as the honourable member just before me did, that this bill is about, quote, supporting Canadian culture or levelling the playing field. But in fact, that's actually not true. Bill C-11 amends the Broadcasting Act by bringing the internet under its provisions. Now, in order to understand the effect of this, we have to understand why the Broadcasting Act was put in place in the first place. In the early 20th century, the Broadcasting Act was put in place to regulate TV and radio because there's a finite commodity. There's only a certain number of radio stations or a certain number of TV stations. And so in order to make sure that both official languages were represented within these platforms, the government determined that they should be regulated, so that French language and culture, namely, would be protected, that it would be given space within these spheres. Further to that, there was a definition given to Canadian content. We call it CanCon. And so there was this determination that a certain percentage of the content would be Canadian, CanCon. And the goal there was to protect our culture, to make sure that it wasn't just American content that was making its way up to Canada, but rather that Canadian content, things produced here, and a whole host of other criteria that are used, would be given space. Now, that's within the realm of TV and radio, which is limited. But now we're dealing with a space that is infinite. It's unlimited, the internet. Anybody who wants a website can have a website, no matter their language of choice. Anybody who wants to have a YouTube channel can have a YouTube channel. Anybody who wants to have a space within TikTok or Instagram, etc., can have a space. We are no longer dealing with a finite resource. The government doesn't need to regulate which content then should be prioritized and which content shouldn't be, because we're no longer dealing with limitations. There's space for everyone. And I would plead with the government to perhaps look back on the record of what the former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien had to say with regard to this. In 1999, he faced a similar question around the internet and whether or not it should be regulated. And after undergoing thorough investigation and a public inquiry, the determination was made that it should not be. He determined that the internet was so different than TV and radio that to treat it the same would actually be to stifle progress. And so after numerous public consultations, because there have been many done since Chrétien, here we are, willing to function in a regressive way rather than maintaining the progressive stance that was taken by the former Jean Chrétien. Now, at that time, I'll read what the directive stated in 1999. It said this: the Commission, the CRTC, expects that the exemption of these services, internet, will enable continued growth and development of the new media industries in Canada, thereby contributing to the achievement of the broadcasting policy objectives, including access to these services by Canadians. In other words, the determination was made that the internet would not be scoped into the Broadcasting Act, that it would not be regulated. And the reason for that was because there was this belief that innovation would take place if it was left alone, that advancement would take place if it was left alone, that growth would take place if it was left alone, that opportunity would be seized by all sorts of people from all sorts of regions with all sorts of backgrounds and from all different linguistic ways. I would invite this government to consider its regressive stance and pull this legislation. On the internet, everyone has a spot to showcase their talent. On the internet, every single individual in this country has an opportunity to thrive should they wish to. Most people in this country have a smart device. You need nothing more than to showcase talent and make a name for yourself. The gatekeepers have been removed. In fact, it's never been easier for Canadians to succeed. It's never been easier for creators from a variety of linguistic and cultural backgrounds to reach not just a Canadian audience, but a global audience. So for this legislation to build walls around these individuals and keep them hemmed in within Canada is so egregious that it's hard for one to even fathom the reason for such legislation. Why would we punish our young creators? Why would we punish the next media content creators? Why would we insist that a regressive form must be kept, that progress shouldn't be celebrated? It baffles me, but I'm not the only one. It baffles Canadians from coast to coast, whether it's legal experts talking out on this topic, speaking out on this topic, or digital-first creators speaking out, or just Canadian consumers who simply just want choice. The fact is the gatekeepers have been removed. Where a creator used to have to put together a pitch or a package and bring it to the gatekeeper, such as CBC or Chorus Entertainment or Bell Media or Rogers, and they would have to plead with them to accept their package, to accept their idea, to accept their creativity. That used to be the way it was done. But now with the internet, we've entered this magical space where creators, innovators, thought leaders get to put their content out there and allow the Canadian people themselves to determine whether they like it or not, whether they want to watch it or not. We've removed the gatekeepers. It's incredible. And instead of celebrating just how amazing that is, this government is hell-bent on putting legislation in place to make sure that we maintain these old, antiquated ways.
Shame.
Why? Why? Isn't the very nature of the arts something that should propel us into the future? Something that should have forward momentum? Something that should be creative and innovative in nature? Isn't that the whole point of the arts? So why would we hem these individuals in? For the minister to say that this bill somehow modernizes the Broadcasting Act is incredibly disingenuous, as I have laid out. The minister is failing to account for the tremendous progress that has been made, the creativity that has been allowed to flow. Take, for example, Justin Bieber. He went big in approximately 2013. And the way he went big was because he put out a few songs on YouTube, and he got discovered. He didn't have to put together a big media package, though he could. He didn't have to depend on gatekeepers to either accept him or reject him, but rather he could put his talent out there. And his talent was discovered, and we know that he went big, and he's a Canadian artist that we're proud of. There are many more like him who are aspiring, And by putting a bill like this in place, by putting Bill C-11 in place, what we're saying to that next generation is don't bother. Don't bother. We want to subject that next generation to the same rules that we subjected artists to in the 1970s. Forget progress. If you want to engage in progress, perhaps consider moving to the United States of America or South Korea or the UK. But in Canada, Bill C-11 puts this massive banner that says we are opposed to innovation, we are opposed to progress, we are opposed to celebrating artists.
Shocking.
Bill C-11 ultimately will do two things. It will censor what we can see online because the government will dictate the content that is there. And secondly, Bill C-11 will determine the extent to which creators are allowed to thrive. In other words, the government will go through and pick winners and losers. Some content creators will be deemed Canadian enough, and other content creators just won't make the cut. If they make the cut, they'll be promoted. If they don't make the cut, they won't be promoted. There is nothing progressive about censorship. Nothing. There is nothing progressive about censorship. And that is exactly what this bill is about. It is about censoring Canadians and what they can see, what they can hear, and what they can post online. And it's about censoring artists and whether or not they have access to an audience and to what extent that access is granted. When speaking about this bill, Margaret Atwood, who is an extremely well-known Canadian author, didn't mince her words. She was pretty direct about it. She called it, quote, creeping totalitarianism. Pretty damning.
Wow.
Not my words. Margaret Atwood. Creeping totalitarianism. Now, I think in order to understand this a little bit more, we actually have to go back to the origin. We have to go back to the origin of this bill. We have to talk about the motive, because I think that's very important for Canadians to understand. Now, this bill we know started out as Bill C-10 in 2020, and it's gone through a number of iterations since then, but the worst parts of this bill remain intact. Right. In fact, one could argue that it's actually worse than ever, in part because it's had opportunity to change. The government had opportunity to hear from witnesses. The government had opportunity to hear from experts, and the government made a decision to ignore those voices. The government has had opportunity to respond to the Senate amendments, which were very thoughtful, very reasonable, and the government is making the decision to disregard most of those amendments. So one could argue then that the government is actually wanting this bill to be as egregious as possible. So what brought us here anyways? Why is the government so hell-bent on Bill C-11 going through the way that it is? Well, the evidence would say it's because of broadcasters. Broadcasters wanting to maintain power and wanting to hold money. So you have these large broadcasters, CBC, Bell, Corus Entertainment, etc., and they are limited by CanCon rules. A certain percentage of their content that they show on their traditional streaming platforms has to be Canadian content. Now, of course, this acts as a limitation to them. Those are their words. That's what they've said. They don't view that as an opportunity to show more Canadian content. They testified in committee that they view it as a limitation. And so because they're limited, they have to show a certain percentage of Canadian content, CanCon. They say then these other streaming companies should have to do the same because they want it to be same. Further to that, these broadcasters have to pay a certain percentage into an art fund. This art fund can then be drawn from by Canadian artists who are producing CanCon and used for that material production. Now, because these traditional broadcasters have to pay into this fund and these larger streamers don't, the broadcasters went knocking on the Liberals' door and said, hey, We want legislation to be brought in place to quote-unquote level the playing field. We want you to go after these streaming platforms, and we want you to make sure that they're showing a certain percentage of Canadian content, and we want you to make sure that you're taking a certain percentage of their revenue and putting it into this art fund. Now, at first glance, that might seem reasonable, except that when you dig into it further, you realize that the broadcasters and the big art unions are simply gatekeeping. They're not wanting to celebrate progress. They're not wanting to look forward to the future. They're not wanting new artists to succeed. They are simply wanting to gatekeep. They're wanting control or power, and they are wanting money. I want to talk about the foundation on which this bill is built, because it's a false foundation, and it has to do with those who came knocking on the Liberals' door for this legislation. This bill is based on the deceptive notion that Canadian content creators or artists can't make it on their own merit, that somehow they need this special fund in order to make a go of it. But YouTubers and TikTokers, online creators, are proving this notion wrong each and every day. They are succeeding without drawing from the art fund. They are succeeding without the government mandating that Canadian content must be watched. They are succeeding because they have incredible talent to watch, incredible talent to offer. And Canadians are finding themselves drawn to it. Now, there's this idea, though, that in order to succeed as an artist in Canada, you need monetary support, and that it's the government that should provide this monetary support. Furthermore, there's this other misinformation that's being spread by the government, and that is that people won't choose Canadian content unless it's forced in front of their eyeballs. That a certain percentage of what is offered on television or the radio or now the internet must be Canadian, otherwise people won't watch it. Well, how degrading is that? Like, as if our artists don't have the ability to produce content that people might want to consume all on their own? No. Instead, the government must rush in and rescue these poor Canadian artists because without government intervention, they won't succeed. What a lie! What a crux. No. Canadian artists are incredibly talented individuals who can make a go of it all on their own.
We have a point of order from the honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Well, we've listened to 18 minutes of disinformation and conspiracy theory. Then the member says that the bill is a lie. I think she has to withdraw that comment given the disinformation we've had to sit through when we sat through it respectfully.
I made my own statement. I mean, we don't want the use of that word, as much as we possibly can. But I'm also going to make a suggestion that the people that are having side comments, side discussions while the member is trying to present as well is probably not as respectful as either. So I would suggest that we all sit and listen and get ready for the questions and answer component of the debate. The honourable member for Lethbridge.
With regard to money, the Heritage Minister claimed that this bill would capture $1 billion from large streaming platforms. Now, to this day, he's not able to provide how this $1 billion figure was arrived at. So we'd actually still love that document, by the way, if at all possible. But according to the government, they say that they're just forcing the large streaming platforms to pay their fair share. That's how this $1 billion is going to be brought in. And again, at first blush, perhaps that seems reasonable. Perhaps these foreign streaming platforms should just pay their fair share. The government says that this money will save Canadian culture, as if it's dying. I'd be curious to know who says it's dying. I'd be curious to say who says it needs to be rescued. Who says it's fragile? Who says it's on the verge of being extinct? And aside from all of that, and most importantly, isn't Canadian culture what the Canadian people determine it to be? And last I knew, the Canadian population is actually growing. So I think Canadian culture is probably alive and well, don't you? Anyway, it doesn't matter, because neither the minister nor his department have been able to show me that document that shows that this $1 billion would somehow be extracted from these foreign platforms and then infused into the Canadian art scene.
Show me the money.
The reality is though, it doesn't matter. It's insignificant. And the reason why it's insignificant is because as much as Bill C-11 might produce this $1 billion, the way that things are right now is much better. Much better. Investment in Canadian production isn't drying up, as this government would like Canadians to believe. That's a false notion. In fact, investment in Canadian production is better than it's ever been before, without government intervention. Huge investments are being made, and let me go over that here for just a moment. According to Wendy Noss of the Motion Picture Association Canada, she testified at the Senate committee, stating that they spent more than $5 billion with a B. That's 5 times more than what the government is hoping to bring in through this legislation. So they've spent $5 billion, one company, by the way, $5 billion, one company, $5 billion. I'll say that one more time, just for the honorable member so he gets that. The government is claiming that they'll bring in $1 billion. Already there's private investment being made to the tune of $5 billion. Wow. With a B. You got it. You got it. That's in 2021 alone. $5 billion. So this government would rather have its way, shut down private investment, suppress that, in order to bring in a government-dictated $1 billion.
Shame. Painful.
How regressive can you be?
Yes.
How punitive can you be? Like, the government claims to support artists, and yet they're going to do this. They're actually going to shut down the industry. They're actually going to punish the industry that is pumping $5 billion into the creation of content here in Canada in 1 year alone. One company. That is not progress. That is incredibly regressive. Let me be clear. This $5 billion actually accounted for more than half of all of the production in this country. More than half. And 90% of the growth in this sector over the last decade. Hold that up against the government-dictated art fund, and the government-dictated art fund fails in comparison. So do we want more government legislation, or do we actually just want freedom to reign?
Freedom.
I think we want freedom to reign.
Freedom.
We're talking about a production company that hired, trained, and provided opportunities for more than 200,000 of Canada's most talented creative workers. More than 200,000. That is far more than the Art Fund has ever propped up. And we're talking about more than 47,000 businesses that were supported in 2021 alone. Again, far more than the government-run art fund has ever supported in 1 year. So again, you can have government-dictated funds, or you can have private flowing funds. One is far more successful than the other. So, we have to ask the question, is the problem that investments aren't being made in Canada, in its production industry, or that our culture is somehow at risk of disappearing, or is there something else? I would argue that the sector is alive and well, as I've proven. And I would argue that Canadians are alive and well, and therefore so is our culture. So there must be something else. There must be something else. and I've alluded to it, but let's explore it further, shall we? Gatekeepers. We have a government that loves to support the big gatekeepers.
Yep.
The big unions, the big bosses that like to keep power and control, the money in their hands. We have a government that is more interested in those individuals, which compose several thousand people, than they are concerned about the vast majority of Canadians who are consumers who enjoy the content online and the freedom to explore what they will, or the creators, the tens of thousands of creators who are putting content out there and reaching global audiences. This government says, forget them. We want to serve the several thousand union bosses. We want to uphold the power and control and money that the broadcasters want. That's our focus. Shameful. This bill is based on the false notion that artists can't thrive without the government. But in fact, we know they can. We know they do. We know that they will. Part of the problem is that the government insists on using an antiquated definition of what Canadian content is. It's this whole host of criteria that make no sense at all. You can have a film like Canadian Bacon that doesn't make the cut. You can have a more recent production, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. It's written by a famous Canadian author. It's being filmed on Canadian soil. It stars Canadian actors. It employs Canadian producers, but it fails to make the cut. So as much as the member opposite might want to point to Schitt's Creek, well, the title tells my audience what I think of that. So perhaps, there's an opportunity then, of course. So perhaps there's an opportunity then to consider a different way. Perhaps instead of applying these shackles of a certain percentage of CanCon and a certain percentage of revenue needing to go towards this art fund, perhaps we can actually just release all from those shackles. Perhaps instead the level playing field actually needs to be set higher rather than lower. Perhaps it's actually about allowing broadcasters and the internet to exist freely. Perhaps it's actually just about creative merit. Perhaps it's just about tailoring your content to an audience that wants to watch what you produce. Perhaps it's actually just about letting private production companies make tremendous investment into our nation and our artists and helping them to thrive. Perhaps it's about being progressive. Perhaps it's about being futuristic in our thinking, as the former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien actually had in mind when he said no, he would not regulate the internet. Now, everything I've talked about up to this point is extremely important, but there is one point that I have not yet touched on, and it is even more so. And that is the fact that this bill captures user-generated content. Now, this government had plenty of opportunities to make sure that that was not the case, and they did not take those opportunities. When I talk about user-generated content, I am talking about your Uncle Joe's videos on Facebook. I'm talking about those videos on YouTube of kids doing stupid stuff. I'm talking about...
Order. I'm hearing a lot of chatter in the back corner, and I'd be more than happy to put them on the question list when questions and comments do come. But let's respect the honourable member who's speaking. The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
He said that they were going to go after my Uncle Joe's videos. He doesn't do crazy conspiracy videos. He's not a conservative. He's okay.
Order. I just want to make sure we just have respect for one another in the chamber when members have the floor and are speaking. And again, chatter does get a little high in this. Chatter does get a little high in this chamber sometimes. So I'll just remind folks that lower voices do carry more in this chamber. The honourable member for Lethbridge.
Everything I've talked about up to this point is significant. But the one point that I have not talked about is user-generated content. And make no mistake, This government had every opportunity to make sure that user-generated content or ordinary content was not scoped within this legislation. And yet this government refused every opportunity that it was given.
Shame.
Now, when I say ordinary content or user-generated content, I'm talking about those videos that are put on Facebook. I'm talking about Uncle Joe's video. I'm talking about Aunt Kathy's video. I'm talking about your mom's video. I'm talking about your video. I'm talking about the amateur YouTube channel that is set up in order to put out some crazy ideas, or maybe do some stunts, and perhaps capture an audience. Because that's what some Canadians wish to do. Because they think it's fun. Because it brings them joy. Because perhaps they're hoping to make a go of it and make it big. I'm talking about those individuals who are taking advantage of this free space called the internet, who are putting something out there and saying to Canadians, you can like it or not like it, but I present it to you. And if Canadians love it, these individuals go big. And if Canadians don't love it, or if the global audience doesn't love it, then usually it doesn't go too big. But regardless, those individuals have the right to put it out there. Bill C-11 will revoke that right. Bill C-11 will revoke that ability. It will move their content down in the system and make it undiscoverable, which means that this government will be determining who wins and who loses. This government will be determining which content gets seen and which content doesn't. And it doesn't matter if it's from a large streaming platform or from simply an individual using Facebook. That's crazy.
It is.
And we heard from witnesses at our committee in the House of Commons and in the Senate committee who raised this issue, whether it was content creators themselves who are incredibly concerned, or Canadians who are incredibly concerned, legal experts who are incredibly concerned, consumer groups who are incredibly concerned. There is massive concern around this scoping in of user-generated or ordinary content. In fact, there were some legal experts who went so far as to say that it actually likens us to places like North Korea or China, where the government is monitoring, surveying, and actually controlling what can be posted online. Now, that should be very concerning for everyone in this House. That's not Canada. That doesn't ascribe to the values that we call Canadian. I mean, we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms for a reason, because we, at least in theory, value freedom. We value choice. We value opportunity. But when the government determines that it's actually going to regulate what can be posted, what can be seen, what can be heard online, then we're no longer functioning within that realm of freedom. And at that point, then, we are not only taking away from consumer choice, but we are also stagnating the success of these many digital-first creators and individuals who would wish to make a go of it and capture an audience online. And not only for this generation present, but I'm actually talking about next generations to come. Those individuals who are to come after us, who would wish to seek success online, the government will have already determined their future. I'm talking about homegrown comedian Darcy Michael, a self-proclaimed pot-smoking gay man. He was turned away by traditional broadcasters, he told us at committee, but now he's enjoying tremendous success on YouTube. I'm talking about a woman, a South Asian woman from Toronto who goes by Auntie Skates. She's in her 40s and she decided to take up skateboarding during the pandemic, and she thought it would be kind of cool to bring people into her journey with her. So she thought she would start posting videos and including some funny quips. People loved it. They still love it. She's done extremely well for herself. She was able to quit her job in finance, and now she's able to just make a go of it on YouTube. She's able to invest in her family and in their quality of life, and she's enjoying it tremendously. You see, the freedom of the internet and the opportunity to advance oneself within this space without needing to worry about gatekeepers has been quite magical for many. Moms have been able to stay home and enjoy a better life-work balance. Youth have been able to, use their creative imaginations and their skill behind a smartphone, and they've been able to capture an audience, and many of them have gone viral. It's amazing. So it's unfortunate that we have a government that doesn't take the opportunity to celebrate these individuals. It's unfortunate that we don't have a government that takes this opportunity to celebrate innovation and forward thinking, the momentum that is being gained within this space. And instead we have a government that is insisting on regulating the internet and bringing it back into the ages of radio and television. I mean, I'd be curious to know who in this place pays for a cable package. Probably very few of us. Why? Because we don't want what we see to be controlled for us. Instead, we like on-demand streaming because at the end of the day, we want to watch what we want to watch when we want to watch it. So for this government to bring the internet under this umbrella of the Broadcasting Act, which is incredibly outdated, is wrong. At the end of the day, Bill C-11 will do two things. It will censor what Canadians can say so that homegrown talent and creative content here in Canada will no longer succeed based on merit. Instead, content will be subject to a set of criteria that bureaucrats in Ottawa, and it can be directed by Cabinet, will use to determine its level of Canadianness. And this will favor traditional art forms, of course, over the new creative content that is coming out. As a result, we heard at committee that many cultural groups, including BIPOC Canadians and Indigenous Canadians, will actually be hurt. Furthermore, Bill C-11 will censor what Canadians are able to see, or in other words, what consumers are able to access online. This piece of legislation will effectively make the government a regulator of the internet. The search bar will be conditioned to follow a set of algorithms that are predetermined by this government. And so Canadians, when they go searching, will not find the things that they freely wish to find, but rather the things that the government wishes to show them. So on behalf of Canada's amazing creators who have achieved tremendous success on new media platforms or who seek to do so now or in the future, and on behalf of Canadians who value the freedom to choose what they watch and listen to online, I move the following motion. The following amendment, I should say. That the motion be amended by deleting all of the words after the first word that and substituting the following. The order for the consideration of the amendments made by the Senate to Bill C-11, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act and to make related and consequential amendments to other acts, be discharged and the bill be withdrawn. Thank you.
Mrs. Thomas, seconded by Ms. Gladue. Moves. I just want to make sure. Is it Mr. All right. Moves the following amendment. That the motion be amended by deleting all of the words after the first word that and substituting the following. The order for the consideration of the amendments made by the Senate to Bill C-11, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act and make related and consequential amendments to other acts, be discharged and the bill withdrawn. The amendment is in order. Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess, in listening to the member, the only thing that I can take that's positive out of her comments is the fact that once again, the Conservative Party is showing great contrast between what it is that the government is trying to do versus what it is that the Conservative Party wants. We in the Liberal caucus understand and appreciate the arts community and how the Canadian Broadcasting Act has done absolute wonders for our industry, for actors, actresses, and creators in many, many different ways. And the modernization of this legislation is absolutely critical. After all, 1991, a lot of things have happened. As I mentioned earlier, whether it's the Netflixes wasn't there before, the Spotifys and the craze, the need to modernize is there. It's very real. The Conservatives want to march us back. The question is, how far back do they want to go, Mr. Speaker? Listening to the member, will she stand on her principles and then be very clear to Canadians that the Conservative Party's intent is to get rid of the Canada Broadcasting Act in order to level the playing field in the name of so-called misinformed freedom?
Honourable member for Lethbridge.
Only a Liberal could skew the facts so much. To accuse the Conservatives of somehow taking us back. Let's be really clear. Let's be really clear here, because the bill that we're discussing today, Bill C-11, is a Liberal bill. Yep. And Bill C-11 takes the internet, which is this infinite, magical, innovative, forward-thinking space, and puts it back under the Broadcasting Act, which was last updated in 1991 and originates from the 1920s.
Great idea.
Yikes! If that's not backwards thinking, I don't know what is.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député Pierre Boucher, les Patriotes Verchères.
The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm concerned because I listened to my colleague's speech, and I must admit, very honestly, that if I were a poorly informed individual who was basing my information on my colleague's speech, I would be scared. I would be scared that I couldn't express myself on Facebook or on internet or post a status on any social network. I would be really worried. Whereas when you find out what the real truth of the bill is, what the real situation is, the former version, the current version, we've all looked at what's been told to us by groups and various people, experts. And then when you look at the current bill, there's no censorship there. So I'm worried when I see people here in this House, in Parliament, where we should be trying to elevate debate and give the facts. It's concerning to see the opposite happen. It's concerning to see the Conservatives try to find out how low they can go. Earlier, we heard from the member for Winnipeg North that Conservatives are using their opposition to Bill C-11 to fundraise. I'd like to hear from my colleague how much money they've raised with this campaign.
The Deputy de Lethbridge.
What the honourable member left out of his statement was the fact that the Quebec government, under Premier Legault, has written an open letter to this government pointing out actually that it is censorship. Exactly. So that's an interesting fact that the honourable member might want to include next time. Because his premier, the premier of Quebec, actually would like to see this bill looked at committee, because the premier is very concerned that Bill C-11 will actually put the CRTC and cabinet in charge of dictating what French culture is. Yes. Now, that's called censorship, yes, I believe, isn't it? And further to that, the Premier Legault, is concerned that the CRTC and cabinet would control the extent to which the French language and culture is given space online. Now, Quebec actually thinks that they should have the power to determine that for themselves. Now, why do they think that they should have the power to do that for themselves, and they're concerned about Bill C-11? Well, because it's censorship. Because this government has the intent of actually censoring what content is and is not available online, and to what extent that content is French and upholds French culture. So, yes, in fact, it is censorship, and I would invite that honourable member to go and speak to his premier and understand those concerns better.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député de Rosemont-la-Petite.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very concerning to hear my colleague display the breadth of her ignorance about broadcasting, the CRTC, and this entire subject. Why does she think that Rogers, Videotron, and Bell are contributing to all sorts of cultural creation in Canada, and yet she's defending YouTube, Google, Amazon, and Apple to let those companies have the privilege to continue not paying and not contributing to cultural production? Why is she taking their side? Why does she want to keep giving them an unfair break?
De Lethbridge.
I welcome the opportunity to repeat a part of my speech. I don't know if the honourable member caught it, so I'll just clarify for him. So right now we have one company, just one production company in this nation that is responsible for 50% of all production in Canada. Furthermore, they invest over $5 billion. Furthermore, they support over 200,000 jobs. Furthermore, they support over 47,000 Canadian businesses. And the stats that I just listed are from 2021, and things only got better in 2022. Imagine that. Imagine that. Now, let's take his question then at face value. He's saying, well, what about Rogers, and what about Videotron, and what about Bell? Let's add CBC to the mix, shall we? Well, what the government plans to do is get about $1 billion through their legislation, and they think that this $1 billion will match what these large broadcasters are putting into the fund. $1 billion or $5 billion. You can have $1 billion through this legislation, or you can have $5 billion without this legislation. Now, I'm not a mathematician. But I do have the ability to quickly do the math on this one. And that is to say, if we allow freedom to reign, we are 5 times better.
Yeah! Questions and comments? Question and commentaire. The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
And I want to thank my colleague for her hard work standing up for freedom. Now, the Senate took a look at this with their sober second thought, and they came with an amendment that tried to protect people's individual content and to exclude that from the scope of the bill. Why does the member think that this Liberal government won't support that amendment?
Yeah, good question.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge.
To enter the mind of the Liberal government is something beyond my ability. Certainly, I wish I could at times, although I suppose that would be a scary place, and I'm not really a fan of horror movies myself. But nevertheless, the question is a thoughtful one, and so I'll give it a thoughtful answer. The Senate brought forward some really great amendments on Bill C-11. 2 of those, in particular, that I wish to comment on. The Senate removed Clause 7. Now, Clause 7 gives Cabinet the ability to direct the CRTC, which allows for partisanship to enter this bill. That's a scary thought for any government. Doesn't matter whether the Liberals are in power or the NDP or the Conservatives, it doesn't matter who's in power. There should never be partisanship introduced into a bill like this. Clause 7 allows for that. The Senate tried to remove it. The government put it back in. That should be very telling to Canadians as to what their intent is. Secondly, the Senate took Clause 4 and changed it in order to protect user-generated or ordinary content that people would put online. The Senate removed that. The Senate protected users. This government made sure that they changed that and gave themselves the power to regulate that individual user-generated content. So again, I think that's very telling in terms of what this government intends to do with this bill. I can't suppose why they would make those decisions, except that they want to hold the power. They want to direct what Canadians can see, hear, and post online. They want to make sure that they maintain their thumb on the internet. And in doing so, then, they are censoring what Canadians can access.
Prise du débat, continuing debate, l'honorable député de Berthier-Masquinongé.
The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Well, Mr. Speaker, at the very beginning of my speech, I'd like to say that I will be sharing my time with my very distinguished and dynamic colleague for Shefford. Mr. Speaker, C-11 is about culture. It's not about censorship, it's about culture. It's about identity. It's about national identity and pride. Culture is the very essence of who we are. This bill isn't about censorship. It's rather about promoting our culture, our cultures, I should say, Canadian culture, Quebec culture, Indigenous cultures. We need to make our cultures more visible. We need to give more visibility, Mr. Speaker. This isn't about telling people you can't watch such and such content. From the very beginning of the debate 2 years ago, because C-11 is the former C-10, we've been hearing about cat videos on and on. Let's be serious here. The real threat isn't about C-11 creating censorship. The real threat is caused by platforms that have revolutionized the world of telecommunications. C-11 is about modernizing an act which hasn't been updated since 1991, which is a very long time ago. I don't know if you remember. But in 1991, we didn't all have a smartphone in our pockets. It was a completely different world. And that's why we need to modernize this legislation. The cultural sector is asking us for that. The broadcasting sector is asking for that. The Quebec cultural sector is asking us to pass this legislation quickly because they need it. We're talking about losses of billions of dollars. I'm sorry, I think I might have said 70 billion a week. That sounds like a bit too much. I'll have to check. But the key point is, a lot of money is getting lost every single week while we delay. We should protect the cultural sector. Now, C-11 will protect and promote original Francophone content and other content. It's just we're focused on the Francophone content, but also Anglophone Canadian original content, and as well as Indigenous content and some from visible minorities. If we want to protect our culture and promote it and make it more visible, we need incentives. It's not about preventing people from posting news statuses on Facebook and say whatever they want. It's not about forcing people to make certain choices. It's about discoverability. Imagine for just a moment the percentage that is Francophone content in North America. It's a very small fraction of the total. If you focus just on the number of times that videos are watched by users, well, it doesn't come up very often in suggestions. That's the issue. It's not about fiddling with the algorithm. It's about giving the CRTC the power to enter into talks with these companies and see what they can do to make local culture more discoverable. We also need to promote our culture. When you look at online platforms, it's clear that there's not a lot of Francophone content. When you look at the boards of directors of Canadian and Quebec companies, it's pretty clear that there aren't enough women on those boards. In both cases, we need measures to increase that proportion. That doesn't mean you're preventing anyone from applying. It just means you're promoting, making it more accessible. For example, making sure that women are more aware that these positions are becoming open. And it's the same thing with culture, Mr. Speaker. With C-11, we just want to increase the visibility and the performance of our local Francophone content. We simply want to make sure that there's a mandatory contribution to the Canadian and Quebec broadcasting system. So mandatory doesn't just mean rebroadcasting old shows. It means participating in the creation of real local content, which is not a matter of, say, an American film that's being filmed in Vancouver. I mean, that's great. It generates local revenue. We're all for it. But when I say local, I mean a local creation by local artists and creators, which represents our culture. When, for example, racialized people are saying, I don't see someone who looks like me on television, that is an issue. We need to make sure that people can see people that they can identify with. We need to increase representation, and this is just the same. It's a matter of broadening the CRTC's coverage to all of the media that affects us. It's that simple. We need to ensure that there's francophone content that is being screened for the first time. We need to say to large American platforms, if you're coming into our market and you want to stream your content in our market, well, on the one hand, that's good because that's a good way to distribute information. It gives access to more information to more people. And no, it does not restrict access to cat videos. It gives more information to more people. But it's also flooding the market. And that is where we are within our rights to say that we have our own cultural universe to protect. I often think about the agricultural exception when I'm speaking in this House. And today I'm here to discuss the cultural exception. We cannot go ahead without protecting our culture. It's important. When people are coming to our market to make money, we have a perfect right to tell them, yes, we're very happy to have you here. It's great. But we also have the right to be able to recognize our culture in our media. It's not about banning certain content. It's about promoting local creations that represent our culture properly. Now, another positive part of C-11 is that we're saying that it really is not ideal that in 2023 we're trying to modernize a broadcasting act from 1991. It's been a very long time. There's been real negligence on this file. So in this legislation, the idea is to revisit it every 5 years. And to those who are concerned, I think that we are perfectly capable of creating reasonable, smart policy and coming back to it after a few years of its implementation to see what the impacts have been, to really refine it. That's when it will be key. So in the last few minutes of my speech, Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to say that the Quebec and Canadian cultural sectors are supporting this bill strongly. I just found the number that I was looking for earlier. I was actually talking about 70 million, not billion, every month. That's the correct number. $70 million a month that we could be losing, according to the former Minister of Heritage. I don't know if that number was fact-checked, but I'm assuming that it was. Now, there were 3 bills that were awaited in this chamber. There was C-11. They were all related. There was C-11 to focus on local content. There was also C-18, which will be the last one in this group of 3, to say that if you're using the content, you should pay some money to encourage the journalism sector. And finally, the third, about online hate.
Censure. Il est question de vivre ensemble. Again, this isn't a question of censorship. This is about finding a way to live together, being reasonable, and finding a way to create an internet world that really represents who we are. We need to see ourselves reflected on TV so that we know who we are, so that we don't forget ourselves. Well, I say TV, but whatever kind of screen we're talking about, the same thing applies. So let's pass this essential bill. Thank you very much. Questions and comments?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, so thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the comments from my colleague across the way. And one of the things that I look at, and the members made reference, is the fact that the Broadcasting Act has not been updated since 1991. And how things have changed. Many of those platforms, not many, all of those platforms virtually did not exist in any form, whether it was the Netflix, the Spotify's, and others, and how this legislation modernizes the Act, thereby allow us to enhance Canadian content and ensure that there's a fair playing field. And if the member can just provide on his thoughts in regards to the advancement of technology, which has enabled the internet to be as successful as it has been, and there is a responsibility for the government to bring in this legislation.
The Honourable Member. Well, the only thing that's been concerning me in Parliament recently is that more and more I agree with the colleague for Winnipeg. No, but seriously, he's entirely right. In 1991, Mr. Speaker, we used to have to type out our university papers on a typewriter. This is a whole new world. And that's why it's important in C-11 to have this 5-year review. Doesn't mean that we even have to wait a full 5 years. If after 1 or 2 years we realize, there was some unintended effect here, well, we can adapt, we can change things. But that requires flexibility, and that takes goodwill on the part of parliamentarians, which we don't always have, unfortunately. Questions and comments?
Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I heard that the Premier of Quebec sent a letter to the Minister of Heritage saying he was concerned about this bill because the bill violates freedom of expression. Is the member also concerned about this? The Honourable Member. Well, listen, I haven't seen the letter in question, but I'm not sure that the Prime Minister, the Premier of Quebec was worried about censorship. I think that what the government of Quebec is worried about, as all national governments have been worried about in Quebec in the past, is that we can have local programming. Culture is really essential, Culture reflects us, Mr. Speaker. We need to be reflected on these different platforms. And I talked about that in my speech, the fact that Indigenous people, racialized people, these people need to be seen as well. That's why we need to move forward with this bill that will really create a discussion. Now, we need to be careful with all the misinformation that's out there. This allows the CRTC to talk to companies about how they want to advance local content. That's the issue. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, if my colleague is surprised that he agrees with the Liberals, maybe he'll also be surprised that he might agree with the NDP. What a day. But as he said, Quebec Francophone culture needs to be reflected, it needs to be supported, it needs to be allowed to flourish. And I don't understand how the Conservatives from Quebec are unanimously against Quebec culture here. They're going against our Quebec artists. So what does my colleague think about the Conservative position here? The Honourable Member. Well, I think it's disappointing. And they're right about my colleague's right about the fact that this is a big day. But maybe if I can reassure my colleague, it actually does agree that it doesn't happen that we agree with the NDP. The only thing we disagree with is which government should be in charge of dealing with social matters. Maybe we can have a beer about that later and discuss that. In terms of the Conservatives' position, it's disappointing. It's disappointing to see this disinformation. And I would ask people to be reasonable, to look at the bill that they have here, rather than just following talking points. Continuing debate. The Honourable Member for Shefford. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's with some humility that I rise this afternoon to speak about this important bill, after my very excellent colleague from Berthier-Masquinongé. I want to underline the really excellent work of my colleague, the member for Drummond, on this subject. It's really important for Quebec culture, which is at the very heart of the Bloc Québécois mission. Broadcasting is undoubtedly the most effective tool for disseminating our culture and defining our national identity. The Bloc Québécois obviously is in favor of modernizing the Broadcasting Act, which has not been updated since 1991. Given the alarming evolution of information and communication technologies, we really need an update. You know, in 1991, I was listening to music on my Walkman, my yellow Walkman. And as far as I recall, I was just starting to get interested in CDs. I didn't even know what the internet was, so that was a while ago. Now, the Bloc Québécois has made major contributions to improving previous versions of the bill. It was previously C-10. And I'll just talk a little bit about the new version, Bill C-11. So first, with the protection and promotion of original French language content, and then I'll talk about the misinformation surrounding this bill. And finally, I'll conclude by talking about how important it is for local media to adopt this bill. First of all, the discovery of Canadian programming services and original Canadian content is important if we want more original French language content. We also need to enhance Canadian programming in both official languages as well as in Indigenous languages. That's crucial. It also includes a mandatory contribution to the Canadian broadcasting system in the event that a company is unable to draw on Canadian resources for their programming. Then there's the presence of first-run French language content to ensure that new French language programming is available on Netflix, for example. So it's not just old programs available. And there's a sunset clause ensuring a review every 5 years. The Minister of Heritage had promised that the Bloc's amendments would be included in the new version, and almost all of them are. Nothing is left to chance in this kind of bill, and we wanted to make sure that we corrected things in the event that a single change could have an impact on the bill. We need to remember that technology is always evolving very quickly, and we need to have a long-term vision to avoid the bill becoming obsolete in just a few years. From day one, the Bloc, supported by the entire Quebec cultural community, worked really hard to improve and pass Bill C-10 before the end of the parliamentary session. During the last campaign, ensuring that Bill C-10 passed was one of our first proposals on our election platform. The cultural community in Quebec and Canada have been waiting for this law to be updated for decades. The first request we got from the cultural community came just a few days after the bill was tabled, and the request was simple: make sure that this bill is passed as quickly as possible. We've waited long enough. The objective of the new bill remains the same as the previous one: subjecting web giants to the Broadcasting Act, forcing them to contribute financially to the creation and discovery of Canadian cultural content. The CRTC will be given new powers to determine which online services must be regulated and what quotas must be respected. C-11 will allow for better regulation of video broadcasters such as Netflix, Apple, Disney+, Amazon Prime, and online music companies as well, like Spotify, YouTube, Apple Music, and so on. C-11 will require these companies to contribute Canadian content when commercial items such as music albums are uploaded and distributed on their platforms. However, there's this exclusionary clause, 4.1, which was discussed earlier, which has been revised. So social media creators, users, and influencers are exempted from the law. I think we need to remember that. So it doesn't matter how much money a creator makes from their content, the law plans to exempt so-called amateur content on social networks, and it will focus on commercial products. CRTC will also be able to impose conditions related to discoverability and showcasing Canadian works. The law will not affect algorithms that can influence recommendations made to users. The department says it wants to focus on the results in terms of discoverability and not intervene directly with these algorithms. Quebec, Francophone, and Canadian content must be much more accessible on these platforms. Ottawa would like to give CRTC the power to discuss with each digital company how much it should contribute to Canadian content based on its particular business model. Secondly, The Liberals, the NDP, and the Bloc supported and tried to improve this bill, throughout the parliamentary session of spring 2021. The Conservatives were against this bill from the very beginning. They launched a smear campaign trying to find all kinds of flaws in the bill, and some of their ideas were very far-fetched. At the parliamentary level, they used all kinds of strategies to slow down the process and obstruct it, both in committee and in the House. They've essentially taken Parliament hostage under false pretenses, claiming that the bill infringes on the freedom of expression. But since 1991, there has been a provision requiring the CRTC to respect freedom of expression. It's always been respected, and there's no indication that this will change. That is what Pierre Trudel, professor of law at the University of Montreal and an expert on the CRTC, said. He was very clear. There's no threat to the freedom of internet users. There's no thought police on TV, and there won't be any online either. Considering how popular these platforms are, there's no doubt that this update is necessary. Statistics concerning music consumption among Quebec francophones over the last 15 years show that half of users follow YouTube recommendations to choose their playlists. As for streaming services, 26% of users choose songs by the platform through playlists, and 17% follow the recommendations. That's based on listening history. So these figures demonstrate the importance of making Quebec, French, and Canadian content easily discoverable to users on platforms. There are alternatives to algorithms that exist. For Spotify and Apple Music, for example, a considerably larger offer of French language playlists could be a possible option. One of the CRTC's missions is to ensure the proper functioning and development of the Canadian broadcasting system. So it's required to respect freedom of expression and the other foundations of the Charter of Rights. Third, the Quebec and Canadian broadcasting sector is in crisis. That needs to be said. Based on a report from August 2020, it's projected that local radio and television services would suffer a total revenue loss of $1.06 billion between 2020 and 2022. 50 radio stations were at risk of closing within 4 to 6 months of the report's release, and another 150 within 18 months. This would result in approximately 2,000 job losses, or 24% of 2019 employment levels. The report added that at least 40 of Canada's 95 local private television stations would cease operations before 2023. Now, the most vulnerable operations are AM stations and also smaller independent radio and television stations in smaller markets across Canada. So radio and television revenues have been declining for years, and COVID-19 only made things worse. We know that the internet has completely changed the way in which young Quebecers access their favorite series, movies, radio, and music, and consumer trends have changed dramatically. The online streaming market is dominated by foreign players, and among young Quebecers, the bypassing of the traditional broadcasting system is a very notable trend. Among Quebec francophones aged 15 and up, the vast majority of people listen to music on YouTube at least a few times a year. There's a study from CEFRIO that noted that more than 8 out of 10 Quebecers used a social network in 2018, which is an increase of 16% over 2016. So you can see that really the internet is changing the game, changing the way people listen to music. I know I don't have a lot of time, but I have other data as well showing that the number of Canadian productions has been declining by 12.4% every year between January 2017 and December 2020. So the industry is in crisis, notably due to these changes. It's clear that Canadian content is essential. If we don't tell our own stories, no one else will do it. And I think that's really essential. If we need these recommendations on funding Canadian content through public funds and spending requirements for foreign online broadcasters, as well as provisions strengthening the CBC. I was with Martin Goujon, an artist, last night. He's been promoting Quebec Francophone culture among students. I've met with local media many times, and they're all unanimous here. They are saying that we need to pass Bill C-11. Let's not wait any longer.
Hey, commentaire.
Questions and comments.
L'honorable député
The Honourable Member for Fredericton. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for her speech. As I look at this bill as a Canadian, but also as a mother. My two sons are growing up in a very quickly changing world where a lot of things are happening online.
The minister has said that this bill is about supporting Canadian culture, but that's actually not true. You see, the bill actually stifles creators. It stifles their voices. And in fact, subject matter experts have actually said that it likens Canada to countries like China or North Korea. So will the Prime Minister stop this damning overreach and kill Bill C-11?
The Honourable Minister for Canadian Heritage.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives had an option. They could side with Canadians, they could side with our music creators, with our film producers, with our actors, but they decided to side with the tech giants, abandoning the cultural sector.
That's terrible.
Speaker. And that's a shame in itself.
The senators tried to introduce an amendment to exempt certain individuals from this bill. Does the member support that amendment? The Honourable Member for Shefford. In my speech, I said that C-11 was really focused on commercial entities, not individuals. And what I'm hearing from the Conservatives is that this is going to violate freedom of expression. So when they say individuals, you know, I really think that this comes back to a lot of misinformation that we've heard about cat videos and so on. But really, this bill meets the needs of artists. They've been bashing Quebec by saying that this is just coddling Quebec artists, and that's unfair to our local artists. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with my colleague. It's high time we passed C-11. It's important for local artists, for the cultural sector. I just want to ask her to take a minute to reassure everyone that when it comes to freedom of expression, despite Conservative propaganda on this issue, we will still be able to look at photos and videos of cats and dogs on YouTube, and we'll still be able to read what we want. The Honourable Member for Shefford. Well, I think I did this by showing that a professor from the University of Montreal clearly showed that this is absolutely not the thought police on the internet. But more than that, Mr. Speaker, if violating freedom of expression means ensuring that Quebec content is well represented online, well, then that's worth it. What I want to see is more Francophone content. If C-11 promotes Francophone culture, that's great. We need to be more representative. We need to show all the diversity of Canada. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I entirely agree with my colleague's speech. I just want to say something in English.
From Lethbridge is speaking. She talks about the big unions as if artists are represented by big unions. I think she may think that that's true, but there is no collective bargaining among artists. There is a group called the Writers' Union, a voluntary association of people who try to write for a living. There are no union bosses in the artistic community. Does the Honourable Member from Shefford agree that the member from Lethbridge is confused on this point?
The Honourable Member for Shefford. Well, Mr. Speaker, I entirely agree. The member for Lethbridge didn't understand the situation properly. And sorry if I got a little bit carried away, Mr. Speaker, but what I've seen is that the member for Lethbridge is really doing a show about this, but I don't want to see her doing a show. I want to see local Francophone artists doing a show. And for that to happen, young people need to be able to discover the content online. Otherwise, it's just a statistical fact. If it's not there, if it's not discoverable, they won't be able to see it. I don't want to see the Conservative show. I want to see a real show.
Order. Statements by members. Déclaration de député. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the next 2